Statement, Secretary of State, West Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on winter pressures. Can I start by saying that my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House, will be with the nurse who was stabbed in a horrific attack at Royal Oldham Hospital on Saturday. Nurses are the backbone of our NHS. They should be able to care for their patients without fear of abuse or violence. As she goes through treatment for her injuries, we pray for her speedy recovery, a full recovery, that she be left to recover in peace. I want to start by thanking our NHS and social care staff for their remarkable effort, stamina and care in the most challenging of circumstances. Over the past few weeks, I've seen firsthand staff doing their level best in hospitals and care homes across our country, in the South West, in Essex, in London, in South Yorkshire and the North West. Even when patients are left waiting far longer than they should be, in conditions they should never be made to endure, they are still at pains to stress that the staff are doing their best. Madam Deputy Speaker, I said on day one in this job that I would never gloss over problems in the health service. I will not pretend that everything's going well when it is not. The experience of patients this winter is unacceptable. I visited one A&E department over Christmas where I was told on the way in that I was lucky as I'd come on a quiet day. Yet as I walked through the hospital, I saw patients on trolleys lining the corridors where they were being treated without the dignity or safety they should expect as a minimum. I saw frail elderly people on beds in the emergency department, many with dementia, crying out in pain and confusion because ultimately they were in the wrong place for their care needs. This was supposedly a good day. The King's Fund has said that the NHS is facing a toxic cocktail of pressures this winter, and they are right. 14 years of underinvestment and a lack of effective reform has combined with a tidal wave of rising pressures. This has been the busiest year on record for our ambulance and accident and emergency services. We've had severe cold snaps, with temperatures as low as -15 in some parts of England. 5,100 patients are in hospital beds with flu, more than 3 times this point last year. Alongside the impact on patients, the rise in respiratory infections saw 53,000 NHS staff forced off work sick in the first week of this year. The result has been patients let down by ambulances that don't arrive on time, A&E departments that leave them waiting 12 hours or more, and the continued normalisation of corridor care. This is not the level of care staff want for their patients, and it is not the level of care this government will ever accept for patients. I said coming into this winter that 14 years of failure can't be turned around in 6 months. It will take time to fix our broken NHS. Since July, we've done everything we can to prepare the NHS for winter. After 4 months of silence from the previous government, I called the BMA on day one, met them in week one, and within 3 weeks negotiated a deal to end the junior doctors' strike with a new deal for resident doctors. For the first winter in 3 years, staff are on the front line, not the picket line. The Chancellor made immediate investment in the NHS in year to fill the black hole we inherited and prevent us having to cut back on services. We've introduced the RSV vaccine, with more than 1 million people protected against the virus and counting. In total, 29 million vaccines have been delivered for flu, COVID-19 and RSV, with more patients protected against flu than at this stage last winter. If anyone is yet to get themselves vaccinated, it is not too late for them to protect themselves, their family and the NHS. Check if you're eligible and book through your local GP or pharmacy. Madam Deputy Speaker, we're working hand in hand with NHS England and care leaders, and I continue to meet regularly with senior leaders in social care, NHS England and the UK Health Security Agency. We have an excellent national operations centre that's running 7 days a week. Its data allows us to zoom in, not just on individual hospitals, but on individual patient waiting times, respond in real time to spikes in pressures, and manage threats as they emerge. The NHS is now using critical incidents proactively to focus minds and get the system responding to de-escalate and steer them back to safer waters. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm happy to report there is currently 1 live critical incident, down from 24 last week. But I do not pretend that this is good enough. It will take time to get back to the standards that patients deserve, but it can be done. It will require a big shift in the focus of healthcare, out of the hospital and into the community, to free up beds for emergency patients and to prevent people having to call an ambulance or go to A&E in the first place. That is the reform agenda this government is enacting. In recent weeks, we've announced steps to begin rebuilding general practice and immediate and long-term action in social care. On coming into office, we inherited a situation where qualified GPs couldn't get a job while patients couldn't get a GP. That's why within weeks I found just shy of £100 million to recruit 1,000 more GPs by April. We've recruited hundreds of GPs to the front line already and will recruit hundreds more in the months to come. We've announced an extra £889 million in funding for general practice, the biggest funding uplift in years, alongside a package of reforms to bust bureaucracy, slash unnecessary targets, and give GPs more time to spend with their patients, our first step to bringing back the family doctor. 10 days ago, I visited a care home in Carlisle that was offering intermediate step-down care for NHS hospitals. They were able to give patients en-suite bathroom facilities with rehab in care homes, all at half the price it was costing the taxpayer to keep patients in a hospital bed up the road. Better for patients and less expensive for taxpayers. Yet there are 12,000 patients in hospital beds today who don't need to be there but can't be discharged because appropriate care isn't available. That is why the government is making up to £3.7 billion of extra funding available for local authorities who provide social care. That's why we're delivering an extra 7,800 home adaptations through the Disabled Facilities Grant this year and next year. That's why we've delivered the biggest increase in carers allowance since the 1970s, worth an extra £2,300 to family carers. That's why we're introducing fair pay agreements to tackle the 131,000 vacancies in social care. And that's why we've appointed Baroness Louise Casey to help build a national consensus on the long-term solutions for social care too. Madam Deputy Speaker, from visiting emergency departments, from monitoring the performance of the NHS over this winter, and noting the variation in performance across the country, it is also clear that we can get our ambulance and A&E services working better. So before the spring, we will be setting out the lessons learned from this winter and the improvements we'll be putting in place ahead of next winter. Finally, let me address the issue of corridor care, which became normalised in NHS hospitals under the previous government. I want to be clear. I will never accept or tolerate patients being treated in corridors. It is unsafe, undignified, a cruel consequence of 14 years of failure on the NHS. And I am determined to consign it to the history books. I cannot and will not promise that there won't be patients treated in corridors next year. It will take time to undo the damage that has been done to our NHS, but that is the ambition this government has. Annual winter pressures should not automatically lead to an annual winter crisis. Indeed, there weren't annual winter crises by the end of the last Labour government. That is why this government is investing an extra £26 billion in our health and care services and undertaking the fundamental reform both services need. It will take time, but we will deliver an NHS and a national care service that provide people with the care they need, where they need it, and when they need it. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, Ed Argar.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and as ever I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his typical courtesy in giving me advance sight of his statement. And may I also join with him in saying that our thoughts are with the nurse in Oldham who was so viciously attacked, and like him, we wish her a full and as speedy as possible a recovery. May I also echo his words of gratitude to NHS and social care staff for all they do to help and support patients and our constituents. We last heard from ministers specifically on winter pressures just before Christmas, yet as he set out, the situation has continued to grow more severe. And we've all heard about the pressures from the media, from patients, from our constituents and staff. And indeed, I'll take the opportunity when doing that to recognise the work in this context in recent weeks of the Honourable Lady, the member for Tooting, who I know has been on the front line and I suspect has seen those pressures first hand, and the unacceptably long waits in A&Es for ambulances, corridor care and the impact that it's having on patients. When someone calls an ambulance, they need to know it'll come, but it can't if it's sitting in a hospital car park, as, for example, over 36% of ambulances handing over at my local trust, my local hospital in Leicester, had a 1 hour plus wait, and I'm sure that's replicated around the country. The Secretary of State highlights the number of patients in hospital with flu is triple what it was a year ago, yet it appears the flu vaccine uptake rate for over 65s, at-risk groups and healthcare workers appears lower than last year. Secretary of State, I know, wants more people to be vaccinated, and I share his view on that. But can he set out a little more detail on what he is doing to further drive up those vaccine rates and to ensure that vaccines are available for all those who need and want them? As he also said, we've also seen more than 24 hospitals last week with critical incidents declared. And while it's welcome to see the vast bulk of those have now been stood down, can he set out what support and additional resource is being offered not only to those who've reached the point of declaring critical incidents, but also other hospitals who continue to face pressures? Last year, the government provided additional funding for both hospitals and social care to boost capacity and indeed the vital beds needed in hospitals, as well as to tackle delayed discharges. Can he set out a little more detail of what he is doing in a similar vein? And can he update the House on how many people are currently in acute settings who are fit for discharge but have not been able to be discharged for a variety of reasons? The Secretary of State mentioned pay, saying that he'd negotiated a deal. I gently say to him that what he did was not negotiation, it was capitulation with an inflation-busting pay rise. However, all these pressures come as no surprise to me or indeed to the Secretary of State. He was open and candid, as he often is, in acknowledging there would be a winter crisis this year. NHS England directors were warning they didn't have the resources needed to surge capacity or increase social care packages now, as we had done in previous years. The Royal Colleges said that nothing had been done to mitigate a winter crisis, and NHS organisations were saying they needed more support to prevent ambulance delays, overcrowded A&Es and people stuck in hospital beds because of a lack of community and social care. He knows, and we have spoken before, about the importance of flow from ambulance to A&E and either into a bed or to discharge. So what extra steps is he taking to increase the number of care packages now rather than in the future? And will he look at allowing community hospitals, such as mine in Melton Mowbray, to play a greater role in providing care to local communities to ease pressure on acute settings? These concerns were all raised in September and October. My predecessor as Shadow Secretary of State asked about this, yet the Secretary of State failed to provide an update to the House until ministers came just before Christmas. Indeed, recently I asked a named day question on when the Secretary of State started chairing his weekly winter preparedness meetings. Despite a quick look at his diary, one hopes giving the answer, I received a holding answer, only getting the correct answer after that holding answer had been sent to me, stating it was in December. Can he say which date the first of those meetings was held in December? Before Christmas, I and the Conservatives called for a winter-specific bed increase plan. We still haven't had one. Will he set out what he is doing to increase the number of beds and capacity now? Madam Deputy Speaker, while the Secretary of State talks the talk, he hasn't done the work ahead of this winter. Will he now reassure patients and staff he will urgently boost capacity, resources and support to ensure our constituents get the care they need when they need it?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, where to begin? I mean, the Shadow Health Secretary does a really good line in diagnosing the problem as if these are somehow new facts to him or to the country. In fact, you don't have to be a minister of long service in this House, or indeed a member of long service in this House, to remember only a short matter of months ago when the Shadow Secretary of State was in fact a minister in the department. Time and again, he asked questions about the state of the crisis and the state of the challenge in the NHS today without showing a shred of responsibility of the crisis, which he played a part in creating. Not just him, every single one of his predecessors. Every single one of his predecessors had a hand in creating the situation that was spelled out very clearly by Lord Darcy of underinvestment, botched reform, and creating the situation we see today where pretty much every part of the NHS, whether it's primary care, community care, mental health services, secondary care, social care, every part of our health and care services are under extraordinary and historic pressures. It's all very well criticising from the opposition benches, but he once again resembles the same pattern of behaviour as his predecessor of acting like the arsonist, criticising the fire brigade for not doing enough quickly enough to put out the fire that they started. It is truly shameful. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the questions that the Shadow Secretary of State raised. On delayed discharges in December, the latest data we have, we saw 12,000 on average per day medically fit for discharge but unable to do so. On bed numbers, they're broadly the same as they were this time last year, 102,546 versus 102,226 under the previous government. I think that does say something actually about the extent to which, certainly what we've experienced in our weekly updates, the work that's taking place between health and social care services to improve the flow of patients is having some effect when you take into account our ability to flex up and down bed numbers against the backdrop of higher occupancy from flu, the added challenge of norovirus and other seasonal conditions that we see this time of year. He asked about vaccination uptake. On flu, as I said in my statement, there have been more flu vaccinations this year than there were last year. But he does raise an important issue, which is about vaccination rates among NHS staff. They are lower than we would like or expect, and I think we have to do some work with staff to understand why that's the case and how we can encourage further uptake. Because, as I said in my statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, if staff are suffering with flu having not been vaccinated, not only is that a really unpleasant experience for them, it's also an unpleasant experience for their colleagues if staff are off sick and indeed for patients waiting longer. On critical incidents, he asked about the support that's being provided to NHS organisations, NHS England regional teams working closely with integrated care boards to ensure that appropriate responses are in place to address and mitigate the issues identified within each declared critical incident, all of which will have variations. We've also seen NHS England, rightly in my view, using the critical incident tool proactively to make sure that we can provide wider system support to emergency departments that are under particular pressure. He asked about additional funding for winter. I was very clear when I was Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary of my cynicism about the pattern of behaviour we saw from our predecessors year after year when they would arrive in the middle of winter, often after the winter peak, with a gimmicky package of last-minute funding delivered too little too late without making any real difference on the front line, or to give the impression that they were doing something to mitigate against the crisis in the NHS of which they played a serious part. I said we wouldn't do that. Indeed, we are not doing that. what we did do was, as soon as we came into office, looked at the books, saw the black hole, the Chancellor released additional funding for the NHS in year to make sure that we could give the NHS the resources it needs not to cut back. In fact, it is thanks to the decisions taken by this Chancellor that the NHS has received in year more than £2 billion more than it would have had the Conservatives remained in power. So we don't need any lectures on funding. Indeed, they continue to oppose the £26 billion we provided for the NHS. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, he accuses us of capitulation to frontline doctors who were out on strike because of the way in which they were treated by our Conservative predecessors. I would just say to resident doctors following these proceedings, to patients who can see the state of the NHS today and wish it were better, we are now left in no doubt. Had the country kept the Conservatives in power, doctors would have been on the picket lines this winter instead of the front lines. Taxpayers would have continued to pay a heavy price for failure, and patients would continue to pay the price through delayed and rearranged, cancelled operations, appointments and procedures. It is proof positive that even after they were booted out of office, this Conservative Party has not listened, they have not learned, and they are not fit to govern.
Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. For years, like many in this House, my surgeries and my inbox have had a regular stream of local people who've been waiting far too long for NHS treatment. But what has in fact shocked me the most is when I see these same local people turn up in the A&E when I'm doing my shifts, having deteriorated and even worse pain than before. Locally, there are 66,000 cases of people who have had to wait over 18 weeks for treatment. So does my colleague, the Secretary of State, agree that we need an urgent emergency care plan to deliver much-needed year-on-year improvements?
Secretary of State.
I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend, and can I first of all thank her for the work that she has been doing this winter on the NHS front line, providing support to her colleagues at her local hospital to literally roll her sleeves up and look after people. She is absolutely right that we need an urgent emergency care plan to make sure we see continued year-on-year improvements. I can reassure my honourable friend that that plan is already in the writing. We are learning the lessons from this winter in order to apply them next winter. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I should have said to the Shadow Secretary of State too, I mean, this was the same approach I took when I was Shadow Secretary of State. In fact, the very first meetings I held on winter planning were ahead of the general election in access talks for the departments. The very first briefing I received on winter preparation was on day one in office. And throughout the last 6 months, heading into winter, I continued to talk to staff in the department and NHS England and social care leaders to make sure that we were as well prepared for this winter as we could be. We're now learning the lessons right now to prepare for next winter now.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I associate myself with the comments of the Secretary of State and the Shadow Secretary of State regarding the abhorrent attack in Oldham. The pressure on our hospitals this winter brutally demonstrates the scale of action needed after years of Conservative neglect of the NHS. Across England, 71% of A&E patients were seen within 4 hours last month, but this statistic varies wildly depending on where you happen to live. At Shrewsbury and Telford Emergency Department last month, ambulances had to wait an average of over 2 hours to hand over their patients. Just 50% of patients were seen within 4 hours, and nearly 1,500 patients were left stuck on a trolley for more than 12 hours. Now, statistics like this often fail to have much impact now because we've heard them so regularly, particularly since winter crises have become normalised. But it's very important that we consider who is behind them. Patients like my constituent Emma, who, having been diagnosed with sepsis, spent 48 hours in a fit-to-sit area and then 12 hours on a trolley in an X-ray corridor before finally being admitted, alongside a horrifying delay in the medication required to deal with her life-threatening condition. Yet we often have to wait weeks for data that fully explains what's happening in our hospitals, and no official data is collected about the number of critical incidents. This leaves patients potentially ill-informed, and it makes scrutiny and support in this place, in particular, difficult to provide. So will the Secretary of State commit to introducing faster and more detailed reporting about the live state of play in our emergency departments, including the number of critical incidences and the temporary escalation spaces, and give a timeline for reporting that information? Will he publish information that shows the impact that delays are having, for example, by looking at the number of deaths in emergency departments? And would he action the long-term Liberal Democrat request to publish localised data on ambulance delays so we can ensure support is provided in the areas like Shropshire where it's most needed? Thank you.
Can I thank the Liberal Democrats spokesperson for her usual constructive contribution to proceedings. She's absolutely right to raise the issue of variation in performance across different parts of the country. It is not acceptable, and one of the things we will be doing as a government is to make sure that, as well as creating a rising tide that lifts all ships, we try to raise the floor in performance so that we see far less unwarranted and unwanted regional variation. She talks about the Shrewsbury and Telford Trust. This has had a whole number of challenges over many years now. We've seen some signs of improvement as recently as this week, and we continue to support local leaders as they strive to improve the performance of their system overall. She raises some good and interesting questions about the frequency with which we publish data. It is right, I think, that we ensure that data is properly validated, to ensure that accurate data is put into the public domain, even as NHS England's control room monitors live reporting into the centre. I will take into account what she's said, both in terms of her requests for more live data, collected and published data about critical incidents, and more localised data within individual trusts, including within ambulance services, to monitor variations in response times within a region. I think those are interesting points she would raise. I think the caveat I would put on my answer is we wouldn't want to burden the system with more reporting requirements if that causes a distraction to improvement. But I tend to lead towards more transparency in data and reporting, and I will take into account the representation she's made as we put together our urgent and emergency care plan.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At my local hospital, the Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy, paramedics have had to establish a makeshift ward outside the hospital as ambulances queue up outside A&E. The actual number of people presenting in December 2024 was roughly the same as in December 2019, but there is almost a 300% increase in those waiting over 4 hours at A&E. Does the Secretary of State agree that this is a dreadful indictment of 18 years of SNP rule in Scotland, and that they must use some of the additional £4.9 billion from the UK Labour budget to get a grip? My constituents deserve so much better than this.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that question, Madam Deputy Speaker? It is truly shocking, the conditions that my honourable friend describes at her local hospital. And as I said, often quoted by the SNP, Madam Deputy Speaker, all roads lead to Westminster, and I'm happy to report that up that road from Westminster to Holyrood lies a record uplift in funding for the Scottish Government. They have no excuses for inaction. They need to grip the crisis in the NHS in Scotland as we are here. The difference is, my honourable friend states, they have a record of 18 years, which they cannot defend. And I hope that people will consider that record very carefully when they decide who should govern in Scotland at the next set of Scottish elections.
Chair of the Select Committee, Layla Moran.
Speaker, may I press the Secretary of State on that data point? He'll know it's not just the Liberal Democrats making those representations, it's also the Royal Colleges of nursing physicians, emergency medicine, Health Watch, BMA, Age UK and many others who also want it. And the reason why it matters is that it causes moral injury to staff, it compromises patient safety, and the reason why it's not just corridor care is that actually what happens is it encroaches onto other wards. So my question is, would he commit to releasing that data before the board meeting of NHS on England on February the 4th, but also what assessment has he made on the impact of this winter on less urgent care and the elective waiting lists?
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee for her questions. I can't give her the commitment to publish those statistics ahead of the next NHS England board, but I can give her an undertaking to go away and look carefully at the rhythm and pace at which we publish performance data, and to make sure that we're being as transparent as we can, as fast as we can. I think that should be the principle that underpins our approach to the publication of data. She is right to talk about wider system pressures as a result of what we see in emergency departments. We'll wait to review the performance of the NHS overall as we exit winter. I think we have seen some effective protection of the elective activity throughout this winter, but of course that will vary from provider to provider. And I would just say, she mentions a whole number of organisations there calling for more data transparency. Can I also welcome the representations we've heard very publicly from the Royal Colleges of Emergency Medicine and others about the need to tackle corridor care, and let me just assure her and all of those who've made representations that we are absolutely determined to turn this situation around, to improve the performance not just of urgent and emergency care, but also to make sure we get better system working, because ultimately that is how, through ensuring better patient flows and ensuring people get the right care in the right place at the right time, that we will finally get this country out of the cycle of winter crises created by our Conservative predecessors.
And before I call the next speaker, members will be aware that we have pressure on today, so I am going to finish this statement around 3:15. Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Triaging patients into virtual wards can not only protect the front door of the NHS, but also can be far better for patients. So could the Secretary of State set out what he's doing to hold ICBs to account to ensure that they're putting money into primary care as opposed to where everyone always looks at secondary care?
That is an excellent question from my honourable friend. I mean, this government has been walking the talk on primary care since we came into office, whether it was the immediate release of funding within weeks to employ 1,000 GPs onto the front line by this April, or indeed the £889 million uplift in funding for general practice we announced just prior to Christmas. I do think that care in the home and care closer to home will be how we not only get the NHS back on its feet, but to make sure it's fit for the future. And that shift from hospital to community is one of the three big shifts that will lie at the heart of our 10-year plan for the National Health Service.
Joe Robertson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. The Secretary of State refers to social care in his update on winter pressures. And of course he's right that social care has an important role to play to take pressure off hospitals. But surely he can understand the frustrations of the sector and those in receipt of social care that he's pushed this into a 3-year review that Sir Andrew Dilnot says is an inappropriately a long time. Can I ask him why it's going to take so long? And please, can he put pressure, and I'm sure Baroness Casey is well capable of doing this in shorter time?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm happy to report that people will not have to wait 3 years for action on social care. In fact, we've seen lots of it in the last 6 months. The biggest expansion of carers allowance since the 1970s, the legislation for fair pay agreements in the Employment Rights Bill in the first 100 days of this government, the uplift in funding provided by the Chancellor through her budget, the expansion of the Disabled Facilities Grant. And there will be more for us to do this year, including reform to make the Better Care Fund more effective in its impact. And Baroness Casey's first report will in fact be next year, which will set out the action required on social care throughout this Parliament. And so I hope that reassures people right across the House, and more importantly right across the country, that social care is a priority for this government, and we will seek to do better than our predecessors of actually all parties, as I've made the point before, because we've got to tackle this generational challenge facing our country.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was quite shocked when a young man came to my last constituency surgery in Ealing, Southall, to ask me, as his MP, to help him get a GP's appointment. He'd spent hours on the phone in the queue, morning after morning, and was desperate. If my constituents can't see a GP, they end up in A&E instead. Right. So how is the Secretary of State continuing to work to undo the Conservatives' abject failure to fix the GP crisis, which is fuelling winter pressures on hospitals?
That's right. Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right about the challenge that the Conservatives' failure on general practice has placed not just on stretched GPs, because there are thousands fewer now than there were by the time the Conservatives left office than there were in 2015. It's also the pressure it places on other parts of the system. And that's not just worse for patients, because it's certainly not a pleasant experience at the moment, sat waiting in A&E for treatment. It's also more expensive for the taxpayer, because instead of costing £40 for a doctor's appointment, it can cost £400 for an accident emergency attendance. That is the legacy of the Conservative government. Worse for patients, more expensive for taxpayers. And that's their rotten legacy that we are seeking to overturn.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK Health Security Agency warned last week of elderly people suffering from heart attacks, strokes, chest infections as a result of the recent severe cold weather. So can I ask the Secretary of State if he is any closer to admitting that taking away the winter fuel payment from some of our most vulnerable pensioners wasn't just cruel, but life-threatening?
Secretary of State.
I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's irresponsible as well as inaccurate to suggest this government has taken winter fuel payments away from vulnerable pensioners. In fact, it is thanks to the decisions taken by the Chancellor that winter fuel payments were protected for the poorest pension, which means they will continue to be worth £200 for eligible households or £300 for eligible households with someone aged 80 or over. We also continue to stand behind vulnerable households by delivering the £150 warm home discount for low-income households, providing funding of £742 million to enable the extension of the Household Support Fund, and of course over 12 million pensioners will see their basic or new state pension increase by 4.1%, thanks to the commitment of this government to the triple lock. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I just end by saying, this is a running theme of the party opposite, they seem to welcome the investment in health and social care that this government is providing, at the same time as opposing it. They can't have it both ways. If they don't support the decisions taken by the Chancellor, they have to admit that had the Conservatives remained in power, they would be cutting health and social care services this winter, which pensioners really rely on.
If I could ask members to keep their questions and their answers short, please. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under the last Conservative government, strikes cost the taxpayer millions of pounds and 1.5 million appointments were cancelled. So can I thank the Secretary of State sincerely for making it his day one priority to sort this out. He called the junior doctors, he found a deal which he did within 3 weeks, ending the strikes. We all thank you all across the House for sorting that out. So this will be the first winter in 3 years that staff will be on the front line and not the picket line, as you so rightly said. Isn't this just one example of what a Labour government does when in office, as we always have a laser focus on making the NHS better, unlike the party opposite, who seem to have that laser focus on making it fail? Does he agree?
Secretary of State.
I do strongly agree with my honourable friend and the point she raises. And look, the continued behaviour of the party opposite should send a message to every resident doctor in the country, indeed every member of health and social care staff in the country. Every single one of them will know that thanks to the decision the country took back in July, we now have a government which is committed to the NHS, committed to social care, and had the Conservatives remained in power, we would be going even deeper into the deep hole that they left this country in, and we must never go back there again.
Andrew George.
Deputy Speaker, I accept that the the government is clearly not the architect of the current very unacceptable state of affairs, but could I encourage the Secretary of State just to reflect again on our exchange during the Select Committee just a month ago, where he resisted the recommendations from the President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine to invest in more beds to accommodate additional admissions to hospital to ease the normalisation of corridor care and to ease the pressures within the emergency departments.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, throughout the winter, NHS providers have continued to flex bed capacity in order to meet demand. And the important thing here, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that our approach to investment and reform delivers the system-wide improvements that will help to break out of this annual cycle of winter crisis. And I know that there has been some criticism of the government's focus on elective recovery, for example, asking if it's at the expense of urgent and emergency care. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will not allow a status quo to settle in where the NHS is reduced to effectively being a blue light service, to only being an emergency service. This is a government that will improve urgent and emergency care and elective recovery and primary care and community services and social care, because that's what we need to meet the needs of the health and care needs of people in this century, and that's what we'll deliver.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Winter pressures have caused thousands of cancelled operations, including many of my own lists. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that the dedicated Clare Marks Surgical Centre in Colchester, serving patients in Essex and Suffolk, is an extremely welcome development?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question and the expertise and experience he brings to this House. We absolutely need to make sure that we are innovating in our service provision and shifting the centre of gravity out of hospitals to care and treatment closer to home, indeed in people's homes. And as we've already set out in recent weeks and since the investment announced in the budget, and particularly the elective reform plan, this is a government that will continue to innovate, to provide services that deliver not only great value for the taxpayer, but even more importantly, great outcomes for patients.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Haverhill, in my constituency, research shows that ambulance response times are twice those in Cambridge. We'd also like to see a new co-located and purpose-built red light facility that the police and the ambulance service can use to serve the town effectively and hopefully save money. Can I invite a minister from the department to come to Haverhill to meet me, the East of England Ambulance Service, the Suffolk Police and local councillors to discuss these plans?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can confirm we are absolutely up for looking at co-location of different public services, both to deliver better integration and cooperation between different services, particularly the blue light services the honourable gentleman mentions, and also better value for taxpayers in the process. And I'll ensure that one of my ministerial colleagues makes contact with him to that effect.
Preet Cargill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Health Secretary will know that University Hospitals Birmingham in my constituency recently declared a critical incident, which I am pleased has now been stepped down. As we rebuild our NHS, does the Secretary of State share my view that shifting the focus of healthcare from hospital to community would have a consequential impact on the number of people in hospitals, given the immense pressure they're under?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and can I, through her, thank health and care staff in her city for the work they are doing to get the people of Birmingham through this particularly challenging winter. And she is absolutely right that what we really need to do to make our health and care system more effective and more sustainable is to shift the centre of gravity out of hospital into the community with better and faster access to diagnostics and treatment, but also a bigger focus on prevention, whether that's primary prevention to keep us all healthy and active, or indeed secondary prevention to prevent people from needing to call on health services, particularly emergency departments that are stretched at this time of year.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was pleased to hear what the Secretary of State had to say about vaccine
rollout, particularly the RSV vaccine. I'm even more pleased to say that my constituents in Richmond Park are very diligent uptakers of all the vaccines, but they've been puzzled to find that the RSV vaccine is limited to those between 75 and 79 years of age. And I would like to ask the Secretary of State what plans there are to extend the rollout to those aged 80 and above.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for her question and indeed her showing off of her constituents' uptake. That's exactly what we want. In fact, maybe ahead of next winter we should launch a parliamentary competition. Who can boost uptake most in their constituencies? We'll think about the prize. But more seriously, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm really glad, actually. I'm always glad when the pressure is on expanding access to vaccines. That's exactly the sort of pressure we want. Of course, we follow advice from JCVI, and we will obviously review the experience this winter. JCVI will review the experience, the evidence and the data this winter, and make recommendations which indeed we'll take into account.
Alistair Strathern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The dire state of the NHS left behind by the last government was far too apparent, tragically, to many of my constituents who needed it last winter. One 85-year-old constituent admitted with breathing difficulties had to wait over 30 hours in a chair because there were no beds available. That indignity and prolonged suffering was far from alone. They shouldn't have to tolerate it, and I certainly won't as our MP. So while I welcome this government's action and leadership on ending the doctor's strike and investing in more appointments, what more will this Secretary of State be doing to make sure that next winter many more of my constituents aren't suffering from the same challenges?
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for his question and the spirit of his question, because that's exactly how this government is approaching planning for next winter. I want to see year-on-year improvement in NHS performance, and in particular year-on-year improvement in our experiences of our response to winter pressures. Of course, there are seasonal variations in infectious diseases and inclement weather and all sorts of other pressures that can impact on NHS services. But the point is that the system should be resilient enough to withstand any pressures in any given winter. It will take time to get back there, but that's why this government is already planning for next winter, this winter, learning from the experience, what's worked well, what hasn't, so that we can continue to deliver for the people of this country and improving National Health Service and improving social care services too.
Joshua Reynolds.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the things we could do to help improve the situation in Maidenhead is to reopen the walk-in centre, urgent care centre at St Mark's Hospital, keeping people out of the big hospitals, keeping people out of A&E, and as the Secretary of State said himself, helping people to get care closer to home. So will the Secretary of State meet with me to discuss how we can work together to get the walk-in urgent care at St Mark's back open?
Secretary of State.
Can I welcome the question from the honourable member? I absolutely agree with the thrust of his question that we need to see a shift of healthcare out of hospital into the community with care closer to people's homes and indeed in people's homes. The configuration of services locally, of course, are a matter for local NHS leaders. I would encourage him in the first instance to be in touch with his local integrated care board. If he finds he gets particularly unsatisfactory or unreasonable answers, of course he should feel free to raise them with ministers, but that should certainly be his first port of call.
Kevin McKenna.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I associate myself with the comments about the nursing colleague who was so brutally attacked in Oldham. I'm really thinking of her and her team at this time. Yeah. It's also the case that I've been thinking back to when I was a junior nurse, just starting out, and in that time we faced the same problem. It was just after Labour had taken over from a Conservative government, and the backwash of winter crises that failed Conservative government led to in the first few years of that Labour government are very, very similar to now. Things that made a difference were improving staff pay, NHS plan. I'd like to know from my honourable friend, the Secretary of State, what else he's learnt from the successes of his forebears back then about tackling this now and eliminating winter crises in the future.
Secretary of State.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for the expertise and experience he brings to this House, and I'm particularly grateful he expressed his support and concern for the colleagues of the nurse who was so brutally attacked in Oldham, because I know they will be feeling acutely affected by this. And in fact, I think the NHS workforce right across the country will have felt that shiver down the spine that I felt when I read about that horrific case. Of course, he's right. I'm fortunate to be able to call on every single one of my Labour predecessors, from Alan Milburn through to Andy Burnham, to ask for their advice and their experience and their insight. Of course, as our great late friend, the late John Prescott, would have said, we need traditional values in a modern setting, and it is that modernising tradition that I'm bringing to our approach to investment and reform, because it's the combination of both that delivers results. That's how the last Labour government delivered the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in history.
Lisa Smart.
Thanks very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State will know that Stepping Hill Hospital in Hazel Grove has a repairs backlog reported to be £130 million. This repairs backlog means it's taking even more pressure on the local teams at Stepping Hill to tackle winter pressures. His colleague, the Minister of Health, wrote to me and my constituency neighbour in October to agree with us that she was deeply concerned by the condition of healthcare infrastructure at the hospital. So I'd be really grateful if the Secretary of State could let the House know when we should expect clarity on funding, following on from the budget, per hospital, so that my constituents and Stepping Hill patients get the hospital they deserve.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for her question and for raising those concerns here on the floor of the House. Of course, thanks to the decisions the Chancellor took in the budget, we are able now, through my department, to have an additional £26 billion available for investment in our health and social care services, including estates. I can't promise to fix the backlog that's built up over the last 14 years in a single budget and a single year, but I can confirm to her that we will be publishing our mandate for NHS England and following on from that, planning guidance and financial allocations very shortly.
Serena Brackenridge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under the previous Tories' watch, NHS became in danger of normalising the failure of the party opposite. Patients treated in corridors, horrendous A&E waits, hospitals at risk of being gridlocked as they struggle to discharge patients. Will the Secretary of State continue to be upfront and open about the challenges faced and ensure that the NHS now recovers year on year under his watch?
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend for that question. In fact, when I was sat opposite in the tail end of the last Parliament, I would see my predecessor stood at this dispatch box telling us everything that government was doing, all the wonderful things that she thought they were doing, all the wonderful things that they thought they were achieving. In fact, it was like listening to a completely different National Health Service, a completely different social care system in another country. I came in July, and I was honest on day one that the NHS is broken but not beaten, that these are crises of historic proportions, that we will never sweep them under the carpet, that we will never hide problems to spare political blushes, and that is why I will continue to be, in the coming months and years, honest about where we haven't yet fixed problems, and also clear about the action we are taking to get the NHS back on its feet, make it fit for the future, and build a national care service worthy of the name.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we all share the Secretary of State's aspiration of moving healthcare out of hospitals into the community. But the two GP surgeries I visited in Skegness just before Christmas are really concerned that the impact of the national insurance increases on their staffing budgets will be plus or minus £100,000 per surgery, which means they have to reduce staffing capacity that reduces appointment capacity. So what will the Secretary of State do to help those GP surgeries in that situation? Because it seems there's a conflict between the sensible aspiration and the practical reality.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to for that question, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are 889 million reasons why GPs should be reassured about their financial sustainability for the year ahead. That, of course, is the £889 million allocation for general practice I spelled out before Christmas to provide reassurance for GPs thinking about planning for the financial year ahead. I've been heartened by the response from GPs to that announcement, and I would just gently say to people who criticise the means of raising it that without the decisions the Chancellor took in the budget, we would not be able to invest £26 billion in our health and care services. We cannot have a situation where people welcome the investment but criticise the means of raising it. People don't support the Chancellor's decision, which is perfectly reasonable political position to take. They will have to spell out what services they would cut or what taxes they would raise.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I echo the comments that the Secretary of State made and that my honourable friend, the Member for Birmingham Edgbaston, made to recognise the endeavours of health and care staff during last week's extremely difficult, critical incident, and recognise as well the effective contingency planning that had taken place, including the provision of additional beds at Westheath Hospital in my constituency. With respect to the central support that he referred to, would he be willing to make summaries of the support from NHS England to local trusts this year and in previous years?
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that question. I would be very happy to write to him to set out the support provided by NHS England to health and care services for his community, and I'd be delighted via him to receive feedback from his health and care providers about what support they would like to see from the government next winter and into future years too.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I declare my interest as a Governor of the Royal Berkshire Hospital, and I have a family member who shares in a medical company. I know that the Secretary of State has a really tough job clearing up the mess that's been left in the NHS by the Conservatives. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the Royal Berkshire Hospital estate is not fit for purpose, and especially not to cope with the winter fuel crisis. Can he confirm that a proper level of funding will be available to rebuild the Royal Berkshire Hospital, and that there will be no increase in the 7-year delay announced by the Conservatives in April this year? This will help with future winter crises.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. I will take that as another representation from him on the new hospitals programme, and I can reassure him that we will be setting out our review and its conclusions shortly.
Sally Jameson.
As part of making the NHS fit for the future, moving some patient care from hospital to the community is going to be pivotal. In Doncaster, Mayor Ros Jones and the Council are already well on the way with this, and they're setting up Health on the High Street, which is not just good for patients but also for footfall in the city centre. So can my right honourable friend set out what his department is doing to support areas like Doncaster in delivering on this strategy?
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and I'm delighted to hear of the work that Ros is doing as well as the Mayor to support health and care services and to take health and care to where people are. I hate hearing that there are certain hard-to-reach communities. There are no hard-to-reach communities. There are underserved communities. And we need to make sure that in our determination to tackle health inequalities, to get care closer to people's homes and indeed in people's homes, to do earlier diagnosis, faster access to treatment, that we take health and care services to where people are rather than expecting people to always come to us.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fear that corridor care has already become normalised. And it's going to be, as the Secretary of State rightly says, some time before we get this on the right path. This week there have been reports of a North London hospital advertising for dedicated corridor care nurses. I also think about my constituent, who is a doctor at the Royal Sussex, begging X-ray teams to give her a consultation room so she doesn't have to do intimate exams out in the corridor. What reassurance can the Secretary of State give the workforce in the NHS that things are going to get better?
I'm really grateful to the honourable member for raising that question, and indeed the example she gave of the Whittington advertisement for staff specifically to deliver corridor care. I think the first thing I would say is I would make no criticism of the trust itself in trying to make sure that it's got the right staff in place to deliver the best care possible in the present circumstances. It's not the fault of the Whittington that there is corridor care. It is a legacy of 14 years of Conservative failure. But I would also say my reaction to seeing that advertisement was the same as hers, which is it was proof that corridor care has been normalised. And I want to reassure her, the House, and patients across the country that this government will not accept corridor care as normal care. We will not tolerate corridor care as being acceptable care. We will do everything we can, as fast as we can, to consign corridor care to the history books, and I reassure the staff working in the NHS in these intolerable conditions that we will work with them to deliver the investment and the reform needed to get the NHS back on its feet and make it fit for the future.
And the final question, Richard Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite the party opposite's best efforts to ruin our NHS, will the Secretary of State join me in paying tribute to the hard-working NHS and social care staff in my constituency of Isle of Wight West, who, despite enormous winter pressure, are doing their best to go above and beyond to provide not just exceptional care, but keep the NHS on its feet?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question, and also thank staff on the Isle of Wight for everything that they are doing to support communities across the island against challenging backdrop. My honourable friend, since he arrived in this House, has been an extremely strong, loud and effective voice for the people of his constituency and right across the Isle of Wight, and I look forward to working with him and health and care leaders in the Isle of Wight to make sure that they see their health and care services improving as a result of their decision to send a Labour Member of Parliament and a Labour government to serve our NHS and serve his communities.
That concludes that statement. We now move on to the next statement, and I'll give a few moments for the front benches to swap over.